Okay, so I think we can start now. So welcome back to the final panel of today's conference, our panel 4, starting with Martin Walsh, who is going to present on dhow palms, dhows, speckled green snake. I probably mispronounce some words. Bear with me, Martin. Okay, so over to you.
Oh, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so hello and habari zaku lost, as an in-law of mine in Mombasa used to greet me. My talk today is about words, and it's about the connections between them, and in the longue durée over time, what the analysis of those connections can tell us. And it's and what it's beginning to tell me about some aspects of the Swahili-speaking world in the past. And at the same time, I want to highlight the importance of Swahili lexicography, of etymological and historical linguistic research, and the considerable potential for developing these intertwined branches of study. And in his great dictionary of the English language, Samuel Johnson famously described a lexicographer as a harmless drudge. He was, of course, making fun of himself, but having spent a large part of lockdown last year busying myself in, quote, in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words, end of quote, I can't disagree, though I'm immensely grateful to earlier dictionary makers, the real lexicographers, for their labors. Although Swahili's Johnson, Frederick, can't match the wit of Samuel, and while the language doesn't yet have anything to compare with the Oxford English Dictionary, it does have Sackler's superb dictionary of different dialect forms, shown on the slide there at the left. And we also have Nerson Hinnebusch's magnum opus of comparative linguistics. We've got Lodley and others' studies of word borrowing and a growing number of good dialect dictionaries and vocabularies. And these are precious resources and excellent starting points for further research, as they have been for me since the pandemic began in particular. And prompted by the request to contribute to a festschrift for a colleague, an Austronesianist, I began by researching and writing a paper on the early history of Swahili nautical technology, before distilling some of its main conclusions in a shorter, less technical article. As it happens, that the pop piece shown on the left on the slide, the popular piece was published first, date-wise at least. It seems to still be in press, although it's dated 2020. It's still at the printers, I think, but I've had a copy of it for a while. But I actually wrote the longer, more detailed paper from dugouts to double outriggers. I actually wrote that before, and it's got much more detail. And I won't attempt to summarize all of that detail now, but I will just outline one of the most striking etymologies in it, and that's of the Swahili word dhow. And if you want to read or download the two papers, they're on my academia pages, as shown in the link at the bottom there. So it's no accident, of course, and I don't think it's an accident, that Swahili dhow and English dhow, D-H-O-W, sound the same. And they're generally both traced to an Indian or other source in the region of the Arabian Sea. There have been all sorts of proposals. And Agius, who in the work shown on the right there, he notes attestations dating back to the 18th century in that sort of Arabian Sea area. Hornell and others who have suggested a Swahili origin for the Swahili word dhow, they're in a minority, but they've not been able to provide convincing linguistic evidence for this. And the reason for this, perhaps, or it's not a particular fault of theirs, but the reason is because nobody's really looked beyond the standard Swahili form of the word, which we all know as dhow, plural madhow. And this is a common mistake in research of this kind. And I must say, I've been making it myself for a number of years. It's a kind of linguistic laziness. And rigorous investigation of etymologies in Swahili, it really requires cross-dialectal study, cross-dialectal comparison across the forms in different dialects. You can't just make assumptions from what you hear in the different standard Swahili forms. And this slide, it shows such a comparison superimposed on a composite version of Nelson Hinnebusch's classification of the Swahili dialects. It's mainly Nurse's classification that was then developed and presented in their 1993 book. Although it's never quite spelled out fully there. And as this shows, there are some forms of the word dhow, both north and south, which, like Tumbatu Dalu, have an intervocalic L. They've got an L in the middle. And it's also found in, as you can see, it's up in Mwini, right up there in Somalia and Barawa. It's also found in borrowings in Shamba, Giriama, and other neighbouring languages. And this allows us to reconstruct, or at least posit, a proto-Swahili form, which I've written there following Nelson Hinnebusch's model and conventions as Idalu. There are questions about the quality of that first vowel, and who knows if I'm pronouncing it right, but I'll say it as this reconstructed form as Idalu. And as they argued, L loss is a relatively late process in Swahili. I mean, it happened at different times in different places, but there are some late 18th century records of this word with an L, as written as Dalos, or in some French documents as Dalles. And they're clearly attempts to write down an earlier form of this word, a form similar, or probably the same as that Tumbatu form there, Dalu, or it might well have been from other dialects. The adoption of the L-less Swahili form in languages around the Arabian Sea remains to be proven and worked out in detail. Exactly how that word was taken up remains to be shown, but it may well be, I would argue, that dhow is the oldest, or certainly one of the oldest words of Swahili origin in English, other perhaps than older records of toponyms of place names that you find in older documents. But if anybody knows an older Swahili word in English, then, or candidate for a Swahili word in English, please let me know. The only Swahili boat name that's demonstrably, or in fact isn't actually fully demonstrable, older than Proto-Swahili Idalu, is the generic term for a vessel, Proto-Swahili Kiombo, the standard chombo, a vessel of different kinds. Hence, it became, as it developed from Proto-Sabaki, it became the name for a boat. Or when exactly that happened is difficult to determine. The iconic Mtepe of the Lamu archipelago and Bajuni tradition, in my analysis, is a northern Swahili innovation, and it's not the truly ancient stone boat that's sometimes made out to be. So Proto-Swahili Dalu has its own deeper history, as this slide shows. And I won't expect you to absorb it all at once. It's the augmentative. Dalu is in my analysis, it's the augmentative of an old name for water bailers, which coincidentally we had mentioned earlier this morning. It's an old name for water bailers, which are essential to keeping some boats afloat because they're so leaky. It's a notorious characteristic of some boats, even the historical records of them on the Swahili coast, that without teams of bailers, they were often in trouble. And this word, it derives ultimately from the name for Doum palms, which presumably supplied the leaf strips that bailers were woven from. I've never seen one of these, I think there are some sort of descriptions of them, but I've never seen a picture of one. If anybody has, again, please let me know. And the term for this material, for these woven strips, and so the bailers themselves, earlier Ndalu, again with an L, Ndalu, separately, in a quite separate development, it provided the Mijikenda name for speckled green snakes and other members of the genus Philothamnus. And I show that in the bottom left corner there. It may also have generated another set of environmental terms in nearby Northeast Coast Bantu languages, shown, the series shown up at the top right in blue. But I don't have the evidence. I don't have enough lexical evidence to sort of demonstrate the precise connections. But I consider that a possibility. In addition to tracking the etymology of other boat names and nautical terms in the same way, I've also been working on the names of marine fauna and the related vocabulary of fishing and foraging at sea and on the shoreline. And one of the challenges in reconstructing these particular lexical fields is the lack of data for Sabaki languages other than Swahili and Comorian, for the obvious reason that others don't occupy the coastline and aren't engaged in that economy, that coastal economy, to the same extent. Although in some individual communities and individuals are. Likewise, I've been looking at the names of terrestrial fauna and flora, including birds. This, by the way, is a slide from an earlier presentation. By matching reconstructions with species distributions, it's possible to make inferences about linguistic geography in the past, which is a particular interest on the East African coast and islands because of the evident importance of long distance migration historically. I've also been working on cultivated plants, and most recently, the vocabulary of banana plants and the different varieties, the cultivars, banana cultivars, different types of bananas. And I've been engaged this year in a long-running conversation with banana geneticists, morphologists and others studying the history of bananas and their introduction to and diversification in Eastern Africa. And that includes some of the people on this paper that you might just be able to see at the bottom right of the slide, published by a couple of years ago by Xavier Perrier and others. So we've been together with the Belgian linguist Kern Boston and his team. We've been in a sort of conversation about different aspects of this history, including the linguistic aspects. That's none of this is published yet. Let me hasten to add. The etymological studies of different lexical fields attest, to me, anyway, they attest to what I call the genius of Swahili and related languages. Their creativity, and this is a kind of collective creativity now, their creativity and adaptability. And they also continue to produce surprising connections questioning old certainties and enabling us to formulate new hypotheses. Once you start looking and probing, probing etymology in detail, all sorts of interesting things start to come out, and many of them, can sort of, they take my breath away anyway. And the work on bananas, for example, has exposed some long cherished false etymologies, as well as highlighting the importance of unexpected relationships in the past. For example, between the speakers of Malagasy and Comorian on one hand, and those of the languages of northeast Tanzania on the other, inland to Kilimanjaro. And I could give you a number of examples, but there's one just shown at the bottom of this slide where, well, it's not spelled out, but this word mlali, which occurs in Swahili banana names, and also I think some Comorian ones, is found way inland on Kilimanjaro. It actually derives, it seems, from an older Eastern Bantu word for soot, which still survives as well in Swahili and Comorian. And soot, it's because of that, the sort of black markings on those particular varieties of bananas. And there's lots of examples like that, and some surprising long distance connections, for example, between Comorian and Shambar and related languages.
Martin, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, and I'm getting there. And zooming in on Swahili, the work of cross-dialectal comparison has led me to reconsider an old suggestion of Bernd Heinz, that the boundary between North and South Swahili dialects could be drawn to the north of Mombasa rather than to the south, as Derek Nurse did. And whatever the case, lexical data from the Mombasa dialects has to be treated cautiously as evidence for historical reconstruction, given the mix of northern and southern influences. And more recently, Derek Nurse himself has cast doubt on his early analysis of the north-south split and the historical implications. There's also, I'll just mention this briefly, it also casts into doubt earlier conclusions about the location of the Swahili homeland. In fact, the Sabaki homeland in the north, in the region of the Tana Delta and Lamu archipelago. And for various reasons, I think it's actually much more likely that that homeland was further to the south, somewhere between Mombasa, Tanga, that sort of area, that kind of what's now a current border area. And last but not least, there's also a growing body of archaeological evidence which can be used in conjunction with these refinements of dialect classification to redate Swahili settlement and migration histories. And on the linguistic side, this kind of revision is only possible because of the quantity and quality of data that is currently available. And at the same time, there are huge gaps in our knowledge, and our ability to fill these gaps is threatened by dialect and especially lexical loss. Every word that is unrecorded and lost from cultural memory is a loss to the historical genius of Swahili. It won't stop the development of the language in some of the ways we've heard today, but our knowledge and understanding will arguably be poorer for it. And that is the end. Asantene, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin. Excellent presentation. I'm sure there will be questions later on.